everyone, to today's episode of Be Freaking Awesome. I am one of your hosts, Sammy Kinnison, here with Angela Belford. We are joined by a very special guest today, and I'm actually just going to let Angela take a moment to introduce and sort of share a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm going to try not to nerd out completely because Dimple and I met each other at World Domination Summit when she was leading a improv game called What Would Ted Lasso Do? And she was doing it with, we had a mutual friend already, although if you do improv like that at World Domination Summit, like you're already all best friends, like immediately. Anyway, and so Jeff Harvey was helping lead it, and then I found out that they had a podcast. What would Ted Lasso do? It's amazing. I'm very sad that season's over, so your podcast, I guess, is over for now until they do the spinoff, I'm sure. Anyway, and so we actually had Jeff on the podcast on episode 35, and you should definitely listen to it because he's hilarious. And listening to him and my son talk about real manhood was pretty great. So anyway, so Dimple now is publishing a book, and I've been watching her journey, and it's been super fun to go, oh good, I'm not the only one that this process of publishing a book is harrowing.
Yeah.
So Dimple, tell us a little bit about you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So I am Dimple Dabalia. I'm the founder of Roots in the Clouds, which is a small boutique consulting firm where we use the power of storytelling to heal organizational individual trauma. And I have a book. Yeah, I wrote a book, and it's called Tell Me My Story, Challenging the Narrative of Service Before Self. And it has been quite the adventure going through this process, but I'm really excited about it, and I'm excited to talk about it. So
I'm very excited. I got a chance to be an advanced reader of it, and if you listen to the podcast, you might know this about me. I'm not a finish every book kind of girl. I usually get about 60% through and then be like, okay, I learned what I needed to learn, and I don't feel bad about it. Like whatever. Interestingly, the few months, I'm noticing that I'm finishing books, so maybe my nervous system is calming down that I can actually finish all the way till the end. But with yours, I was very excited because I had a couple of plane trips, and so I just got sucked in completely to it. And the thing that I resonate with so much is that you're talking about humanitarians and that we are humans in there. And I love the whole book. And of course, you talk about fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So I'm a fan. I was nerding out, texting her in the middle of reading different things. But what I specifically am excited about is that you kind of about 60% of the way through the book. So I was glad I finished till the end. You kind of have a manifesto about no, let's talk about how this is going to be. And this fall, we've been working our way through my book. And so we're now at the point where I really talk about redefining success, which is the goal is not to have a flatline nervous system. It is really to be able to feel your feelings and to be able to maneuver your way through. But why do you think that let's start before we get to the manifesto, just because I've read the book, let's catch everybody else up. Tell us a little bit about your background and sort of your journey as a humanitarian, in whatever detail you want, briefly.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I spent almost 20 years in the government. Actually, I did spend 20 years, but 2 of those were in state government. But the bulk of my career was in the federal government doing asylum and refugee work. So of the about 18 years that I did that, 12 were in the field, which meant that I was interviewing asylum seekers or refugees for resettlement in the US. And it was literally my dream job. I ended up going to law school because I was scared to try to do anything else. So I thought, let me just take the easy route, go to law school, and then I'll figure it out. And
we won't talk about the logic of that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But I always knew, even through law school, I was I just want to do something that is kind of in the humanitarian realm. I didn't know exactly what that meant. And so my first job out of law school was actually working for the state attorney general's office in Colorado. And we represented the State Department of Human Services. So all my cases were about child abuse and neglect, and a really tough caseload. But I think, a lot of this type of what I call humanitarian work. And so to be clear, when I'm talking about humanitarians, like, I think humanitarians, often people think of like the people like out in like safari vests and, and they're definitely humanitarians. But, I'm talking about first responders. I'm talking about medical professionals. I'm talking about teachers, like people who are really on the front lines of trying to alleviate pain and suffering in the world. And so I think it takes a certain personality to do that kind of work. And so when I first started doing the work at the Attorney General's office, I really excelled at it. But I think partway through my second year, my boss like had us all go through a training on vicarious trauma. And vicarious trauma is really like, it's the idea that you're taking on another person's trauma just by hearing about it or seeing like pictures, things like that. And at the time I was a brand new attorney, and I just kept thinking like, I don't know why we need this. Like, this is, I can look at my cases and eat a sandwich. Like, it doesn't bother me, which like should have been a red flag, um, but
You
it
might
took
have been
like,
numb.
right. Yeah. But it took like a total of like 10 years before I had my own experiences with that. And so day in, day out, listening to stories of persecution and torture did have an impact on me. And so 6 years into the job, I was into my job as an asylum and refugee officer. I was in Zambia on assignment, and I was really struggling. We were interviewing the last of the Rwandan genocide survivors. We were interviewing Congolese applicants, and we were interviewing what are known as protracted Burundians. So these were individuals who were born into refugee camps and then subsequently had their camps attacked. So they were kind of refugees twice over. And they were the worst cases I had heard in my entire like career of doing this work. And for the first time, like, I couldn't contain my emotions during interviews. Like, normally I had a really good, what I called the wall of professionalism, right? So I could listen to the stories, I could be objective, but this was like really, I was struggling with that. I was having nightmares. I found myself at the bar at the hotel a lot more often, things like that. And so I knew that what I was experiencing was not like okay, like there was something wrong. And I was able to kind of think back and remember to what I had learned a decade before about vicarious trauma. The problem was nobody was talking about it. And especially in the government, where you have security clearances and things like that, people are worried that if I talk about my mental health suffering, that it's going to impact my security clearance, which is not the case for the most part. But um, so uh, in kind of coming back and figuring out how to take care of myself, I started thinking about the fact that like I couldn't have been the only one experiencing this. There had to be other people who are doing this work that must be going through the same thing, but nobody was talking about it. And so I started using the platform that I had within my organization, because at that point I was moving into leadership roles and things like that. And so I started using those platforms to start talking about, hey, is anybody else going through this? This is an experience that I've had. And slowly like bringing, like kind of normalizing, like, oh, this kind of trauma is very, like a real part of doing this work. And then um, I ended up in positions where I could actually like create a curriculum around this, and we were educating teams that were going out into the field and things like that. And then partway through that, like I just completely lost my own like sense of what I was doing again, and I was working all the time. I got picked off to be the field office director for our office in New Delhi. So I moved there, was working all the time. And it was really stressful because it was the height of the refugee crisis. So I was on top of running like our biggest field office overseas. I was taking teams to Pakistan and to Sri Lanka to interview, hundreds of refugees. And within like months of getting to New Delhi, I got really sick. And for the next almost year, I didn't get better. And I couldn't figure out why. And then when I finally came home during the holidays, I went to my doctor here, who's amazing. And he right away was just like, you're like, basically, my nervous system was out of control. I already had autoimmune issues because of all the stress. And he was like, you need to come home. And, talking about success, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
to me, I felt like I can't just leave a job. Like, I haven't even been there a full year. How am I supposed to just turn around and come home?
If not
And
me, who?
yeah. And so it was really, it should have been a no-brainer because it was my health. And it took me 3 full days to finally raise it with my management, who was very supportive. Um, and so I did end up curtailing and coming back. And then when I did, I ended up in a position at kind of like the right hand of our director. And so I was finally in a position to really affect bigger change on a wider level. And so I started talking about how I really felt like we needed to be talking about, not only this kind of trauma, but like what can we do to keep ourselves healthy and happy and all of that. And so I was really fortunate that she was very supportive, and I ended up starting a whole program within our little section of the government based in mindful performance and positive psychology. And that ultimately led me here. So that's kind of the long-winded version, but
I'm smiling often because the details of all of that are pretty intense. I can't wait for everybody else to get a chance to read the book. I particularly am struck, and I've had this conversation a couple of times in the last few weeks, of people like literally being told your job is killing you. And oh, I'm supposed to stop and take care. Like, we're just not given that instructions, I guess, if you will. Is just not. No, in hustle culture, in our Western culture, we absolutely um cannot seem to know to take care of ourselves.
I think what's interesting though, Angela, is that in some cases we are given the instruction to put our own oxygen mask on first, then put somebody else's. And I can tell you, like, as a mom of 2 small kids, there is a reason that they have to say this every single time you get on a plane, because it is not my natural instinct to help myself first. It's not that I haven't been given the instruction, it's that something in me says, no, I need to take care of this, because if I don't, who will? I've got to do this. I've got to do this. And figuring out how to interrupt that just innate drive to take care of the things around me, to say, no, if I don't take care of myself, then I can't take care of the things around me. I think for too many people, unfortunately, it takes getting to that point where, no, I actually, like, literally can't take care of people around me because I am in such a disarray, whatever it might be, health wise, mentally, emotionally, life's falling apart, because I've neglected myself for so long. Now I really have to tune into me. And then that can feel like such a tall task to go after, versus finding the way to do it as we go and to hold those boundaries along. Anyway, the reassurance though that I think this is very natural for all of us to not help ourselves first. There's something about it that's natural. It's figuring out how can we interrupt that and
Yeah.
do something a little different.
yeah.
I had a client that one time said to me, like, oh, before I got my autoimmune disease diagnosis, yeah, I'd let people run all over me. And now I never let them run all over me. And I'm like, do you hear what it took for you to stand up for yourself? Like, that's really hard. So I
Yeah.
guess that's the cautionary tale of this episode. Don't wait.
It definitely is. And Sammy, I really love what you just said, because you're right. Like, I was reading this article once about why, people are like, why do they keep showing us how to unbuckle a seatbelt? But it's true, because in those moments of stress and whatever, people forget how to unbuckle a seatbelt, right? And
Mhm.
so the same thing with the oxygen mask, or that analogy of oxygen mask, that it's not just that I think most of us we have that level of empathy where we do want to take care of other people. And so we will always put other, and especially women, I think, really tend to do this a lot more. But uh but it's also kind of, what's been baked into our minds from like from the youngest ages, especially here in Western culture and in the United States, about, you know, what, like, again, this idea of what it means to be a success, right? And so to be a success, you have to work the long hours, you have to put in the work, you have to go above and beyond. Like, the number of times that I tried to, like, not redefine even, honestly, like, hold people accountable to performance measures in the workplace, saying like, okay, um, if you get like an average rating, like, there's nothing wrong with that. That means you're doing your job, and you need to be doing a lot more to get like those higher level ratings. But there's this expectation that we should all be getting these super high ratings, right? And so it's from the beginning. It's just so ingrained in our culture that we have to operate in this way, and so it creates little neural pathways in our brain. So to your point, Sammy, like, we in those moments, we just default to those behaviors that we've known for so long, and we have to
Well, and
reshape those.
I even think in that to get superior ratings, I had a job in a corporate workspace for a while. It required a significant amount of self-sacrifice, and I was early in my like married and career life. I didn't have kids. My husband also traveled for work, and it wasn't an issue for me to leave work whenever I wanted to. Now, I have two small kids. Like, no, I leave work because I have to pick them up from school, because otherwise, like, DHS is going to come and get, like, there's significant consequences.
Right.
It's not even just like a choice at that point. It's like, no, I have chosen this pathway. So that sacrifice that's required to get to the superior ratings is really hard, but it is baked into our culture. This idea of, no, just keep killing yourself slowly so that everybody else can benefit. That's normal. That's how we all do it, and that's how we should all keep doing it. That's how your parents did it. Let's just keep on. What's the
Yeah.
problem?
And to add to that, in these kind of humanitarian fields, it's even more complicated, right? Because
Yeah.
now everything that you're doing relates to the health, well-being, even like life or death of another human being. And so, to what you said, Angela, about if not me, then who, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we get this feeling like, oh, if I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, like, this person, is not going to be able to leave this terrible country, or, like for doctors, they're going to have some kind of health issue or whatever. Like, so there's this added pressure of serving other humans, that makes it really hard for us to feel like, oh, I can take care of myself first. But it's counterintuitive, but we have to take care of ourselves first so we can keep taking care of others.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine in those scenarios, it almost feels selfish to
Yeah.
take care. When I was working at the housing authority, I redid our work schedule. So we worked until 5:30 every day, Monday through Thursday. But then on Fridays, we got off at 3. And we also closed the office. No one's allowed to answer the phone. No one's allowed to do anything from 12 to 1 every day. And there were people that would like to push back on me. And I'm like, I have to take care of my team. Like, look, we're going to offer people, if they work, they can now come in after hours, 5:30, instead of having to take off work necessarily, or maybe they don't have to take as much time off work. But we saw a huge improvement in our staff. Oh, we also closed the office to the public at noon on Fridays. So that meant from like 1 to 3, you could just get your work done without the phone ringing, without people coming in, and without all of that. The level of engagement that we saw increase in our staff, and just the relief that they had, like, it was a priority to take care of yourself, for us to take care of yourself. I also had somebody that at one point wanted to quit, And she tells her supervisor, no, I've decided that I need therapy. And the only time I can go to therapy is during my work schedule. And so I think I'm going to have to find a different job. And she's like, why would you have to do that? And she goes, well, you guys aren't going to let me take off. And she goes, let me show you the shared calendar. Do you see that Angela has early lunch on Wednesdays at 10? And she said, yeah. She goes, early lunch is code for Angela's going to therapy. Do you want to see my time slot? And mine was like early lunch. And that's what we just put. We would put early lunch. So even if your therapist appointment was from like 8 to 9 in the morning or 9 to 10 in the morning, you just put early lunch. And that day you worked through your lunch. So you took your hour. So it's not like we were exceedingly generous. Although I was like, look, our insurance pays for like 75%. Here's the list of providers. And people were, I mean, the staff was just blown away. Like, this is a priority. And I'm like, yes, you guys, I need you strong and healthy so that you can take care of people. And I know I was an exception, and I'm not trying to say like, look how great I was. I wasn't. No, but I just like, I knew that we were working with people experiencing homelessness and extreme poverty, and I just couldn't. I had to take care of my people.
Yeah, but you should take credit for that because you were ahead of your time. Like, people don't do that. It reminds me of the first time I went to New Delhi. So I was an acting field office director several years before I actually became like the permanent field office director. And when I went, my first day in the office, at lunchtime, I walked out of my office and like I couldn't find anybody. And I was like, where'd they all go? And there was one door, and it was where the assistants used to sit. There was 3 of them, and it was closed. And when I went to open it, it was locked. And I was like, huh. And so I kind of knocked on it, and I heard some rustling. And like they opened the door. It was like dark in there. They were all like laid out on the floor, taking like a quick nap over lunch. And, you know, and they would all eat lunch together, and then they'd take like a half-hour nap because they had an hour for lunch. And I was just like, huh. And I actually like, I was like, I'm so sorry, you know, like, and then afterwards I was like, why am I feeling bad? But it's because we would never think to do that here, even though it makes perfect sense. You've got an hour for lunch, you know, eat something good with people so you have some connection, and then, yeah, like rest for a bit so that you have the energy again, you know? And so I love that you were like kind of thinking in that direction.
We were going to burn through people fast if I didn't. So,
yeah.
So now you had kind of a manifesto, and we've kind of alluded to this, like what it should be like, and I didn't, certainly just remembering back to what my experience was, but like, what are some things that you recommend? And do you think it's, I mean, let me softball it for you. Does it start with leadership? And what do you do if you don't have supportive leadership?
I mean, it's challenging for sure. But I think the first thing that I like to say to people is our organizations are not going to save us. Like, if that's what we're waiting for, you're never going to see it happen. Like, it's just, we live in a capitalistic culture. I'm hopeful that in time it'll change. And especially with everything I've seen kind of post-pandemic, and you know, we saw the Great Resignation. We saw, like, I don't like the term quiet quitting because, again, it's people doing their jobs. They're just not going above and beyond, you know. But we saw a lot of shifts coming out of the pandemic because people realized, like, what am I doing? Like, this is not worth, you know, my life. And so I'm hopeful that in time things will change. But I like to say that our organizations can't change until our individuals change. So to start with, we have to take what I call radical responsibility for ourselves and actually making choices to prioritize our own health and well-being. And so we do that through things like mindful awareness, right? So starting to notice our nervous system reactions, starting to notice our emotions in certain situations, starting to name the actual emotions, because we spend so much time at surface level emotions instead of going deeper and figuring out, like, well, what's at the root of why I am reacting this way, right? And so I say notice, name, and navigate through like our emotions and different situations. And then like we have to start to set clear boundaries. Like we can't do everything. Like we can't. We're not capable of doing everything. And so how do we start to set boundaries? And it's challenging. It's not like an easy fix, especially when it comes to workplaces, because we're not all in a position to say to our boss, hey, like I want to schedule myself this way or whatever. But having said that, I think that organizations are in an interesting place right now where giving people a little bit more agency to feel like they have a say in how some of those things are structured can go a really long way. And then the other thing for individuals is redefining self-care, right? So the marketing industry has, I think, done a real disservice to the concept of self-care because it's so, like often associated with things like bubble baths and, reading a magazine or whatever, all great options. But I really think self-care is about learning to manage our nervous system in real time. Like to me, that's self-care. And so if you think about, I look at it like there's 6 kind of buckets for self-care, right? So we've got like our physical health, our emotional health, our um, relational health. So like each of these 6 buckets that we have, it's about learning to like look at what is kind of low right now and then targeting our self-care practices so that we're refilling that particular bucket in the moment, because that's probably what's impacting our nervous system reaction. And so I think as individuals, the more that we start to take some of these kinds of things and keep them front of mind. And then the other big piece of this is self-compassion, because um, as I said, we have these like very deeply etched neural pathways in our brains. And so because we've had literally decades of doing the same things over and over, we have bad habits, or I shouldn't say bad habits, but habits that aren't serving us necessarily, right? So to change that, it's not easy. And so what it like once we start having this ability to notice things and to start making little shifts, we will inevitably backslide. Like I did when, I initially started talking about all this stuff, the trauma, the resilience, post-traumatic growth, all that stuff. And then I went to New Delhi and backslid and like had to curtail from a job, right? So in those moments though, when we backslide, we can be really, really hard on ourselves. And that inner critic gets really loud and tells us about how much of a failure we are and all these other things. And so creating a self-compassion practice, and all of these things are practices because we have to keep doing them over and over so that we can actually create new neural pathways, so that when I have that backslide, I'm not going to be like, oh my gosh, what is wrong with you? Like, you teach people about this stuff. Why can't you do it? Right. But instead, I'm going to say, all right, well, you know what? Like, I tried. I'm human. I'm just going to start again tomorrow, and we take some of that shame away. And so as we start doing this as individuals, right? And then we have this idea of human-centered leadership, right? So we're in such a metrics-based space where everything is related to our metrics. And metrics are important because obviously, like, we need benchmarks to live up against, right? But when metrics are the only driving force, it's a problem. And so human-centered leadership is this idea that we want to create spaces where people can show up fully. So I always say, like, people don't come to work in the morning and leave a piece of themselves at the door, right? We're whole human beings. And so as whole human beings, like, we need to have that acknowledged in our workplaces. So human-centered leaders are ones that create a sense of social connection on their teams. And social connection leads to this, it creates more trust. It creates what we call psychological safety, right? So that's this idea that I can speak up and I'm not going to be penalized for it. And so the more that we have these like human-centered leaders who are mindfully aware, who are practicing self-compassion, who are doing all these, setting boundaries, the more that's going to spill over into their teams and then into the workplaces. And so, oh, sorry.
I was going to say on the metrics point, we actually this summer here at the Belford group, we have an accomplishments board where each month we list out the things that we have achieved and done. Part of this was to help remind us when we're like, why does everything feel so busy and crazy? And then you look at the board and you're like, because it's a little bit busy and crazy. And one of the items that we keep on there as a metric is number of vacation days taken, because we're really proud that we can accomplish a lot of things and people have time off and people get to go on vacations. It was really helpful over the summer too, when people are more often going on vacations. The past month or two, we've not had as many vacation days taken, but that's a metric that people could employ and it could use as a balance of, are people taking time away from work as well in addition to this?
I love that. I love that idea of making that a metric. I mean, that makes so much sense, right? Like, yeah, I think that's great. And that goes into what organizations can do, right? So you've got what individuals can do. And so the second part of the manifesto is what we need to hold organizations responsible for. And so, especially in this humanitarian sector, I think I look at it as kind of like four kind of cornerstones or commitments. And so first is normalizing and addressing these kinds of occupational mental health challenges and traumas. We have to talk about them in the workplace. We have to help heal them, really. And I know people don't like the word healing in the workplace, but I think healing is part of being human. And so again, if you're employing human beings, they need to be able to heal from the things that they're experiencing.
Wait, before you go any further on that healing thing, here's the thing is that I want to point out that so many businesses are struggling with recruiting quality labor and retaining quality labor. And so from my perspective, I'm like, no, this has a literal cost to you, because if you lose an employee, it's not a widget. You can't just buy another one. And I hope that the labor shortage that we're seeing in our country, and a lot of it because people are like, this is ridiculous. I'm not going to, do all of this stuff and jeopardize my health for a job. I think that if people can begin to see how mental health, it costs them, like, besides losing employees, productivity also, like, so if you are into metrics and you are into productivity, if you can give somebody like a half day or a day to like refocus, recenter, instead of them just dragging that trauma through the whole week and being like working at 10-20% of their capacity, like, take some time and be, fully charged up. It's like our cell phone batteries, they right, that last 10% goes super fast. And it's the same, I think, for humans. And so even if you are thinking like, no, healing, metrics, dude, this is costly. It's very costly. Okay.
And not just,
two.
no, I was just going
go
to say, and to what you're saying, like the productivity for sure, but also you think about if you lose like employees quickly and there's no, number one, you're losing institutional knowledge if you have longer term employees leave, or you're not building it, right? So every time it's starting over from scratch. And then literally the cost of training new people, like there's a financial cost associated with that too, right?
I saw a TikTok. The girl math trend is on, really hard on TikTok right now, but I saw a really like heavy hitting one that said nonprofit math, and nonprofit math is losing someone because you didn't give them a $10,000 raise and spending $20,000 on recruitment and leaving that position open for months.
Yeah.
And that idea of not taking care of people because it's going to cost you money is still going to cost you money. Like you are going to see a dollars and cents difference in this. If you gave somebody extra PTO time, that can help, like that is not going to impact your bottom line nearly as much as them having to quit and find another job.
100%. And, being proactive about it, right? So when people are first onboarding, making this the culture so that it's not like oh, it's there, but I'm not going to take it because people are going to, make me feel bad or whatever. Because the reality is like, so this was the other thing, like, especially during the pandemic, I saw this a lot where people are like, oh yeah, we're giving our teams like a 1 week, 1 week off, or a self-care day every month or whatever. But if you're already in this place of burnout or in this place of dealing with like a particular occupational trauma, 1 day off is not gonna do it. Or the
Mm-mm.
1 extra week, is not gonna do it. And so these have to be changes that are like, again, healing like root systemic issues, um, to start shifting the culture as a whole.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're trying to put out a house fire with a single bucket of water. Like, I get
Yes,
it. You got one self-care day. I don't understand what the problem is.
exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or like I know like organizations will offer like mindfulness programs. And I'm like, you can't just offer a mindfulness program when you're giving like no time during the day for people to actually use them.
Right.
And so, yeah, and so we talked about the second thing was like metrics driven, moving from metrics driven cultures to human centered ones. So again, focusing on the people who actually work there. And one of the things that I think is really important is like bringing, when organizations do like annual strategic planning and stuff like that, there's so many things that go into that. But what I've noticed is that health and well being, especially mental health and well being, are never like a cornerstone factor. And I think
Mm.
that's problematic because when you're creating like workload metrics and you're creating all your other metrics and you're not factoring in the actual impact on the staff, it's, it's not going to be sustainable in the long term, right? And I think
Absolutely.
the other piece of this is as as new generations are coming into the workforce, like organizations have to change this because I'm Gen X, and I know Gen X baby boomers, we still were part of those generations that were like, all right, I'll keep, I'll work till I collapse kind of thing. But like newer generations coming in are like, no, like, we're not going to do this. And so you're not going to retain people if you don't shift along the way as well.
I, as someone who's in the millennial generation, like I would agree with that. And I think that I admire Gen Zers who are entering the workforce who really have firm boundaries and are unashamed to hold those boundaries. And there's something about that I know gets made fun of a lot, that they're just feel entitled at different times. But it is also, I have a lot of hope in that there is a generation in the workforce that's going to say, no, my life is not yours. And I do not exist just to serve the shareholder. So no, where I hope it can carry over is figuring out that way, as your book addressed, in the nonprofit space, in that space of finding good ways to still care for yourself, to hold boundaries, to not take on like the guilt that because I didn't show up extra, now this person, somebody else is going to be in a worse situation. That's, I can see where that's really, really hard to just say, well, that's, it's not to say it's not my problem. And in some ways, you have to figure out a way to say that's not my, like, I have to take care of myself. And it doesn't have to be my role to solve all of the world's problems.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that I just yesterday was on a call with someone that, well, we were setting kind of our strategic direction for this committee that I'm part of, this national committee. And one of our initiatives that we want to push for is, and it's in the housing space. I know y'all are shocked, but there's is like a national internship program and really recruiting younger generation, because basically we have a generation coming up that is like going, yeah, no, that it's not worth it. I'm not going to do that. And that's going to be detrimental to our society at some point if we don't recruit a younger generation to be able to take over some of these very hard jobs, and figuring out how to make the jobs less hard in some way or another, so that we can appeal to that younger generation is really critical.
Yeah. Yeah, and that sense of guilt and shame is it's very real. And it's
Mhm.
not again, it's so ingrained in us that if you put yourself first, it's selfish, it's
Hmm.
indulgent, it's all these things. And that's where like we have to start shifting that, even just how we talk about it, right? So
Hmm.
within organizations, there has to be, um, it has to start at the highest levels. Like a lot of times there's things that can start bottom up and go up, but this has to start at the highest levels where it's not just lip service. It's not just, checking the box and offering things, but actually modeling the behavior, and that's hard because at the highest levels of leadership, we still have a lot of people who have a very old school way of thinking. And so, they're smart enough to realize like, oh, I have to say these things because this is what people want to hear. But yet they're sending emails to staff at like 2 in the morning or,
Hmm.
so it's like your actions have to match what your actual words are.
I had a staff member that was of that age, and I, you know, even at the Belford group, we closed from 12 to 1. And she's like, no, 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 I'll just eat at my desk. And I'm like, no, I need you to like get up and go away from your desk. And she's like, but I want to sit here. And I'm like, then I need to see that you're doing something personal and not that you are not working during that hour. And she's like, I have worked like this forever. Like, you need to stop. And I was like, no, I'm paying you. So I get to say that you are not allowed to work on my stuff from 12 to 1. I mean, I had to get kind of that sassy with her. And I just kept pestering her and pestering her. Well, then finally she's like, fine, fine, fine. I'll take away. And so we had little like futon things like you could sit on and stuff. And then she like
Can I come work for
started
you?
running she started running like an errand or something. And after a couple of weeks, she's like, Angela, I found that from 4 to 5, I used to be exhausted. And now I feel like I can actually finish the day. And I'm like, yes. And we're a creative agency. I'm like, I need you guys to restore your creativity.
Yeah.
If you look on the internet, it says that we're not even open on Fridays because I'm just like, I don't know. If somebody answers the phone, good for you. But like, we've got to keep our creativity flowing. And I think for me, the reason why I'm like this, because I was sitting here going like, you're just sounding like you're all braggy because you did this in 2 different organizations,
You're
but it's
not
not. It's
braggy.
because it's because I did the hustle culture. I set the goal, and it was like in 2011 or 12, somewhere in there that I hit the goal, and I was miserable. I mean, I was working 65 hours a week. I was
Yeah.
barely getting there to be with my kids. I was pretending like I was, oh, I took off and go pick them up from school. And then I drop them off and I go right back to work. And like, I just wasn't present anywhere that I was. And I was super burnout. So I saw it early on, that's been over 10 years ago now. So I think just like I had my nervous breakdown at 24, I had this awakening, back when I was probably 40, almost 40, and just seeing like this is not sustainable. I can't keep doing this. And therefore, if I can't do this, I'm just not even going to let anybody else go down that path. I
Yeah.
want to kind of pull it back. And
Yeah.
so,
And that is the third commitment, right? Supporting rest and recovery because
hmm,
and even just now like you're not being braggy, right? Like I think again we have to normalize this to be like, yeah, I did this thing because it's important. Like rest is important not only like especially for creativity but for any kind of work. And we're not
hmm,
just making this up. There are a ton of studies out there, right? That just getting up and taking a walk for 10 minutes can
hmm,
like make such a difference. But so many of us either spend our days sitting at our desk eating lunch, if we eat lunch at all, right? And there's so much to be said for building in. So I like this idea of like micro moments of rest and recovery.
hmm,
Like it doesn't have to be that, you know, um, hey, I'm going to tell you, you got to go take like a full week off. Like, no, like we can build moments of self care into our day. We can build
hmm,
moments of rest and recovery into our day. And this is where I think like there's opportunities, right? Because sometimes I feel like, especially like before I left my organization and I was introducing a lot of these things, I can't tell you the number of like leadership meetings where I'd see eyes rolling and, and this idea like we have so much work to do. Like, how can you even be talking about this? But again, it doesn't have to be anything big. If we
hmm,
start allowing people, again, to have the agency to say, I'm going to go take a 10-minute walk, or I'm going to go grab a coffee with someone for a half hour to connect over, something else. Like these little things, I will guarantee you will result in more productivity. And even I just read this article this morning on Vox actually about, a lot of these things about like recognizing people's humanity in the workplace. It shouldn't even have to be about the productivity. Like we should
It
just
shouldn't.
be like, we should just be recognizing people's humanity,
Yeah.
And so, and at the end of the day, I understand, like have, we have people we need to serve. We have profits, we have boards, we have all these things, but that doesn't mean, like, I feel like the Industrial Revolution came up with this thing about like trying to standardize everything. And it turned us all into like these little robots of efficiency. And now we're seeing the backlash of that, right? Like we are not robots of efficiency. Like we can be efficient, but we need to have the humanness be allowed to be present as well. And then
I
oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and that leads to that last commitment, which is this sense of a shared purpose and commitment. But go ahead.
I was read about sort of the history of capitalism recently, and that there have been different. This sounds like a really big thing. It kind of is, but there's a different key person that capitalism has tried to serve over time, and it used to be that like business's main goal was to serve the consumer. And then at some point in time, it changed. And so it was consumer capitalism during that phase. Then it changed to stakeholder capitalism. This is also like, this is the super summarized version of this history. But stakeholder capitalism was that there were a lot of different things that were important. We need to consider the environment. We need to consider the employee. We need to consider the shareholder. And we need to consider the consumer, as well as other things. Well, for a while, that got really confusing. What's most important? If I have to consider these dozen things in every decision, what should drive decisions? And at that point, then within the clarifying of things, what emerged was the stakeholder. Well, stakeholders are invested in our business. So we should invest, shareholders invest in our business. So they should become the most important. And that's the phase of capitalism that we are in right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's the phase of capitalism that is really starting to be uprooted, because we are seeing the effects that it is not beneficial for the shareholder to be the most important. And there are some proposals. Anyway, the person who I was reading this from, their sort of proposition is that it actually should be employees, and that employees are on the front line, and employees represent customers, and they're advocating for consumers, advocating for the customers. And if you're taking care of employees, you are taking care of your business.
Yeah.
And that will lead to so many things. Now, if the world and culture as a whole will listen to this person, that it should be the employee, to be determined. But I think that there's so much of that goes into everything you've been saying: taking care of rest, taking care of the mental and emotional space, finding ways to really support the humans for the sake of supporting humans, not for just the sake of productivity, really does. I mean, unfortunately, it feels like it sounds a little bit idealistic and utopian, but I don't think it's that far off. The cynic in me says it's far away, but the optimist in me says we could get there.
I mean, I think we will get there, because I do think things are shifting. Like I do think that organizations that refuse to shift and make more like human-centered cultures or employee-centered cultures are not going to have the same level of success that they've seen. It's not going to happen. I mean, again, we just went through like a massive, like collective trauma through the pandemic. So not only are people still grieving, right? Like, and I always say, like, we were not only grieving like the loss of like the massive loss of life globally, right? But we grieve the loss of life as we once knew it, right? Because we lost so much of like who we were before the pandemic, right? And so what's interesting is I talk a lot about how I'm not crazy about the word resilience anymore because it's so like used so often. And resilience also, people forget that resilience talks about bouncing back to where we were before we experienced a challenge or hardship.
Mm.
But I think what we're seeing through the pandemic is what we call post traumatic growth, right? And so post traumatic growth is this idea that like trauma always kind of separates our life into two pieces, like life before the trauma and life after. And this whole idea of positive psychology, which positive psychology, for people who don't know, is not about being positive all the time. It's just got the worst name, but it's the science of well-being and flourishing, right? And it came about because the founders of positive psychology, they noticed that there was like this group of people that were experiencing incredible hardship and trauma and other things, and they were coming out on the other side of it even stronger than they were before. And so they started studying that to say like, well, what's different about this group of people, right? That they're, it's not just that they're bouncing back, but they're actually coming out better. And I think that that's what we're seeing. I'm hopeful that that's what we're seeing in this post-pandemic world is people kind of standing up to say like, I want better, and I want to be able to prioritize like the things that are important to me. Like, I don't want it to just be like work is everything. I don't want work to define who I am. Like, I want to have those connections and relationships. I want to have meaningful experiences, and all of these things require us to not be like so tied to just the work that we do.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's
I
my
hope
pleasure.
that people have what we really love to do on this podcast is expose you to ideas that maybe you hadn't thought about before. And so hopefully there are a lot of nuggets that you can take and be able to apply them, whether you are working directly in the humanitarian effort of taking care of other humans or sort of indirectly where even just, you know, coworkers, that are walking through things, even if I'm, not in that direct space, how can you take care of other humans and take care of yourself? I hope that people will begin to redefine success in ways that serve them further.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of like last thought or last piece of advice, Dimple, that you'd like to share with people as they kind of go about redefining, I guess, what success looks like? I don't know that we actually came back to that thought. We've talked a lot about a lot of things and indirectly what redefining success is, but sort of in general, any sort of like last piece of advice you want to leave people with?
Yeah, I think just this idea that, the reminder that we are whole human beings. And to me, redefining success is being able to move through life as that whole human being and allowing the people around me to do so as well, so that we're all flourishing. And so any kind of, whether we choose a life in service or any other kind of professional path, none of it should ever be at a cost to our own health and well-being.
I think that's really great. Thank you, everybody, for listening today. I hope that you were able to, accept the invitation to evaluate the things in your life and to see how maybe you can make things 1% better. Maybe it's for you, maybe it's for the next generation. For now, you can find more of our offerings and more things going on with Be Freaking Awesome at our website, the letter BeFreakingAwesome.com. And until next time, we hope you guys go be freaking awesome.